So now, to enter the Jarndyce versus Jarndyce territory, last month, the Court of Appeal overturned the High Court's decision to uphold the government's Rwanda deportation policy. The government then applied to the High Court to take, to the Court of Appeal, sorry, to take the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court to challenge the judgment. And the Court of Appeal gave the government the green light to take it, the Court of Appeal, to the Supreme Court for an appeal today. I'm sure you're not confused and you followed very closely, but not to worry. The point is that ultimately democracy must prevail and judicial activism must fail. The Rwanda policy is an important step in creating a deterrent against the Channel crossings crisis that we have seen over the past couple of years. And it's the right of this democratically elected government to pursue its own policy agenda without political interference from the Court of Appeal or from the ECHR. Joining me on this is my panel of contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the historian and senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Thank you both very much for joining me. Michael, I mean, it is quite a complicating setup that you appeal to the Court of Appeal to appeal against its own judgment. But the government does have a democratic mandate to begin the Rwanda removals. Surely they should be allowed to get on with them.
Yes, I mean, so it goes from the High Court to the Court of Appeal and then to the Supreme Court. So presumably this will be the final decision, I would imagine. I suppose in terms of the democratic point, the government is, or the Parliament is sovereign, I suppose, but the courts are there to make sure that all of the laws we've signed up to are consistent. Now, Parliament has decided that we will be part of the European Convention on Human Rights. They could decide to leave it. That would put us in the same group only as Greece, who left it after they suspended democracy in the 1960s, and there was a military junta, and Russia after it entered Ukraine. So it's not necessarily company we want to be keeping, but if MPs wanted to, they could leave it, and then obviously the court would say, fine, go ahead, because that's what they think the Rwanda policy is breaching. Now, potentially the Supreme Court will decide that actually Rwanda is a safe enough country. Obviously, the High Court made one decision, it was overturned by the Court of Appeal. So potentially there's differing views within the judiciary. So it could be overturned, but either way, it doesn't seem to me to really impinge on democracy in this country.
And Rafe, the Supreme Court does seem to have moved away from the highest point of judicial activism under Baroness Hale when she got herself involved in things which were clearly the responsibility of the executive.
Yes, but this really does play to the government's hands here, because they can then portray themselves as fighting for the rights of the people, being thwarted by the House of Lords and by the judiciary. I'm trying to get excited about this being allowed, but at the end of the day, I view this as a great distraction. You know, the Rwanda policy is simply designed just before an election comes around to convince the British public that the government is actually getting serious, finally. They've had 13 years to get serious. The Rwanda plan is akin to trying to empty a swimming pool with a teaspoon. There's a whole raft of policies that could easily have been enacted by this government. Denmark has done it successfully. You know, Germany has now got temporary visas for asylum seekers so that they know that they won't be staying in Denmark. They've more than reduced by 3 times the number of asylum seekers there, simply by reducing benefits by 50%, by confiscating assets over £1,000. The only thing you have to do, really, is make Britain less attractive than France. And the government has had 13 years to do this. Crack down on the black markets.
England's always more attractive than France for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of your point that, yes, of course, the government could withdraw from the European Convention, but on the prisoner voting rights, it eventually had a negotiation with the Council of Europe so that both sides accepted some element of compromise, that we could do effectively what we wanted, but we accepted that the court had some authority. Do you think there's something along those lines that can be done so that this policy can be implemented in a way that leaves everybody happy?
I mean, I suppose that's possible. That'll be up to the government to have a negotiation with an international body. I suppose to push back slightly on where you're coming from there, I do think there is this misleading notion which is often put out, which is to say that the UK is a real soft touch on migrants and we're incredibly attractive and everyone wants to come here. Now, I think what that avoids is actually that there's almost double the number of asylum applications in France as there are here. So the issue for me is, if you want to get tough on illegal migration, you have to be willing to take your fair share of asylum seekers in the first place. And at the moment, actually, we take relatively very few asylum seekers compared to other European countries. So I do think there's potentially a bit of a misleading image which being put forward.
If those asylum seekers are legitimate.
We must move on. Now, it seems our cultural institutions are dominated by the self-flagellating wokerati. But the question is, where does it take us? Well, a major charitable foundation might just have found the answer: self-cancellization. Langley Chase, an independent charity which provides millions in grants, I think it has £130 million in its assets, for all things social, racial and climate justice, has just announced its decision to abolish itself after concluding that philanthropy is a function of colonial capitalism. Perhaps The Guardian could enter this moral maze too and decide that its slave trade links leave it no choice but to shut up shop. But whilst on the face of it this is a rather amusing, silly story, it poses the bigger question about our unelected institutions and how the left has such a stranglehold on them. Very importantly, it was recently announced that the Office for Budget Responsibility latest appointment, Rita de la Feria, is a Brexit-hating, Corbyn-supporting lefty, and she should fit right in. Now, with me is my panel, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and fellow of the New Culture Forum, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Rafe, you haven't been taken control of by the left-wing wokerati. How did you avoid this?
Well, look, I mean, the thing is, the left understand the importance of institutional capture far better than the right, and they're far more skilled at getting it. You know, Rudi Dushka, the Marxist activist, called this the long march through the institutions. And it really has taken place, you know. I don't think people are quite aware that we've had in Britain, actually, a quiet revolution has taken place. A revolution doesn't mean uprisings and red flags flying from the rooftops. The buildings that house our institutions may look the same, but the people who run those institutions and inhabit them are cuckoos in the nest, who bear no relationship to the people who built those institutions and who ran them until very recently. This all started in the 1990s, particularly under New Labour, and of course it's carried on, unfortunately, under the Conservatives. And I'm terribly sorry to say that again, but along with immigration, the woke takeover of our institutions has been the biggest single damage to our country over the last 20 years.